At 71, she lost her home. Then her German shepherd growled at a man inside her grandfather's cabin. 3 days after being evicted, Evelyn Harper drove through a Michigan snowstorm toward a lakeside cabin she hadn't seen in nearly 50 years. It was the last place left in the world that still felt connected to her past. But when she rounded the final bend, her hands tightened on the wheel. Smoke rose from the chimney. The front door stood open, and beside her the one companion who had never been wrong about people suddenly let out a low, warning growl. If you arrived at a family cabin you thought was abandoned and found someone already living inside, what would be the very first question you'd ask? 3 days after she lost her apartment, Evelyn Harper found herself driving a road she had not seen in nearly half a century. The windshield wipers dragged across the glass with a tired squeak. Back and forth, back and forth. They struggled to keep up with the wet sleet blowing sideways through Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Gray sky, gray trees, gray afternoon. The old pickup truck seemed to be the only thing moving in a world slowly disappearing beneath winter. Evelyn tightened both hands around the steering wheel. Her knuckles looked pale against the dark leather. At 71, she had imagined many endings to her story. This was not one of them. A week ago, she had still been living in a small apartment on the edge of Marquette. Nothing special, just 2 rooms, a narrow kitchen, a living room with a view of a parking lot. But it had been hers now. Everything she owned was packed into the truck behind her. Boxes, suitcases, a folding chair, 3 photo albums, and a life that no longer seemed to fit anywhere. The only living thing she trusted sat in the passenger seat. Ranger. The German shepherd's head rested near the window. His muzzle had gone gray over the years. So had hers, 9 years together. 9 years of quiet companionship. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer advice. He simply stayed. The dog watched the trees pass by. Calm, silent, alert. Exactly as he always was, Evelyn glanced toward him. "You still with me, old boy?" One ear twitched. That was answer enough. A faint smile crossed her face, then vanished. The road narrowed. Pine trees crowded closer. Branches heavy with early snow leaned over the gravel like silent spectators. She knew this stretch, or at least she used to. The memories came in flashes. Summer afternoons, blue water, the smell of sawdust, her grandfather's laugh. Walter Harper had built the cabin with his own hands long before she was born. Every board, every beam, every stone in the chimney. He had been a carpenter, the kind of man who could look at a pile of lumber and already see the finished house standing inside it. When Evelyn's father died unexpectedly during a construction accident, Walter became the steady presence in her life. Not loud, not emotional, just dependable. The kind of man who always showed up. When she was little, she spent entire summers at the cabin, fishing off the dock, gathering blueberries, watching her grandfather plane rough boards smooth while wood curls piled around his boots. Back then, the place had felt enormous, like its own world. She had not returned since her 20s. Life happened. Marriage, work, bills, children, responsibilities. 1 year became 5. 5 became 20. Then somehow 40 years were gone. The truck rounded another bend. The road became rougher, less maintained, more memory than highway. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. She recognized a crooked cedar tree near the shoreline. Then an old split-rail fence. Her heartbeat quickened. The cabin couldn't be much farther. Outside, sleet tapped against the roof. The forest seemed quieter now. Even the wind sounded different, as though the deeper woods carried their own kind of silence. Ranger lifted his head. Not unusual. Dogs noticed things long before people did. Evelyn reached over and scratched behind his ear. Almost there. His eyes remained fixed ahead. The road curved left, then climbed a small rise. And suddenly the trees opened. The cabin appeared. Evelyn's breath caught. For a moment she forgot to blink. There it was, exactly where it had always been. Perched near the lake, half hidden among towering pines, the roofline, the stone chimney, the broad front porch. Weathered cedar siding darkened by decades of Michigan winters. Her grandfather's cabin. Home. Or at least the closest thing to home she had left. She eased her foot onto the brake. The truck rolled forward slowly. Then stopped. Something wasn't right. At first she couldn't identify it. Just a feeling. A small discomfort somewhere deep inside her chest. Then she saw it. Smoke. A thin gray ribbon drifted upward from the chimney. Evelyn frowned. No, that couldn't be right. She stared harder through the sleet-covered windshield. The smoke continued rising. Steady. Fresh. Someone had a fire burning. For several seconds, she simply sat there, her mind trying to catch up. The cabin had been empty for years. Decades, as far as she knew. No caretaker. No neighbors nearby. No relatives using it. At least none she had ever heard about. Then she noticed something else. The front door. It wasn't closed. It hung partially open. Just a few inches, enough for darkness to show through the gap. A cold sensation moved down her spine. The truck engine idled quietly. The heater hummed. Everything else felt strangely still. Even Ranger had stopped moving. Evelyn turned toward him. The dog was no longer looking out the side window. He was staring directly at the cabin. His body had gone rigid. Every muscle tight. His ears stood straight up, forward, focused, locked. A second later, a low sound emerged from deep inside his chest. Not a bark, not a whine, a growl. Slow, controlled, serious. Evelyn froze. In 9 years, she had heard Ranger growl only a handful of times. A stray bear near a campground. A drunk man who approached her truck at a rest stop after midnight. Once, during a thunderstorm, when lightning struck frighteningly close. Ranger was not a nervous dog. He did not invent threats. When he reacted, there was usually a reason. The growl deepened. The fur along his shoulders lifted. Every instinct inside Evelyn suddenly sharpened. The cabin seemed different now. Not welcoming, watching, waiting. The sleet ticked softly against the windshield. Somewhere near the shoreline, a branch cracked. Ranger never took his eyes off the building. Then it happened. A movement, quick, easy to miss. A shadow crossed one of the front windows. Evelyn felt her stomach drop. Not imagination. Not reflected branches. Someone. A human figure moved briefly behind the glass, then vanished. The growl beside her became louder. The dog shifted forward in his seat. Ready, watching, waiting. And for the first time since turning onto that old forest road, Evelyn Harper realized she might not be alone at her grandfather's cabin. Someone was already inside. 3 days earlier, Evelyn Harper had stood in the hallway of a brick apartment building, holding a set of keys she no longer had any right to carry. The building manager had been kind about it. That somehow made it worse. There had been no shouting, no threats, no sheriff at the door. Just paperwork, a tired smile, and a quiet, embarrassed conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes. "I'm sorry, Evelyn." Those were the words she remembered most. Not because they changed anything. Because they didn't. Sorry didn't stop rising rent. Sorry didn't pay medical bills. Sorry didn't keep a 71-year-old widow from packing her life into cardboard boxes. By noon that day, the apartment was empty. By sunset, it belonged to someone else. Now, sitting in her truck on a forgotten forest road, she stared through the windshield at the cabin and tried to ignore the ache that had settled somewhere behind her ribs. Smoke continued drifting from the chimney. Slow, steady, certain. Someone had been here long enough to build a fire. Long enough to make themselves comfortable. Beside her, Ranger never stopped staring. His growl faded, but his body remained tense. Evelyn rested one hand lightly against his shoulder. The muscles beneath his fur felt hard as wood. "It's okay," she whispered. The dog didn't seem convinced. Neither was she. Outside, sleet rattled softly against the hood. The lake beyond the trees looked dark and cold beneath the gathering storm. She should have gotten out. She should have walked up to the cabin and found out who was inside. Instead, she sat there, motionless, because for one brief moment, she needed to remember how she had ended up here. How a woman who had spent 40 years building a life could suddenly find herself with nowhere left to go. The heater hummed quietly. The warm air smelled faintly of old fabric, coffee, and dog hair. Familiar smells, comforting smells. The kind that belonged to ordinary days, days that no longer existed. Evelyn leaned back against the seat. The forest blurred beyond the windshield, and her thoughts drifted backward. The previous year had begun with hospitals. That was how she measured it. Not months, hospitals. Her husband Richard had spent most of his final winter moving between rooms filled with machines, heart problems, complications, treatments, hope, disappointment, then more treatments. The cycle repeated until nobody could remember where it started. Evelyn remembered every chair she had slept in, every vending machine coffee, every fluorescent hallway, every doctor who looked at the floor before delivering bad news. Richard had been gone 18 months now. Sometimes that felt like yesterday. Sometimes it felt like another lifetime. After his death came the bills, stacks of them, envelopes arriving day after day, white envelopes, yellow envelopes, certified letters, each one demanding money she no longer had. Savings disappeared first, then retirement accounts, then the small emergency fund she had spent years building, one piece at a time, like water wearing away stone. For a while she managed. A librarian learns how to stretch $1. She cut expenses, stopped traveling, stopped buying anything unnecessary, then stopped buying things that were necessary. But numbers don't care how hard someone tries. Eventually, the math stopped working. The rent increased twice in 14 months. The landlord wasn't cruel, just practical. Everyone said costs were rising, taxes, insurance, maintenance. Words that sounded reasonable until they landed on someone already sinking. The final notice arrived in late October. She still remembered the sound the envelope made when it slid through the mail slot. A simple sound, paper against wood. Yet somehow she knew before opening it. Some part of her already understood. After that, everything happened quickly. Too quickly. The apartment filled with boxes. Friends from church helped pack. People hugged her, promised to stay in touch, promised to call. Everyone meant well. Most people do. But promises made during goodbyes often drift away once ordinary life returns. Evelyn knew that. She had lived long enough to know the difference between affection and availability. The hardest part hadn't been leaving the apartment. The hardest part had been realizing she had nowhere else to go. Not really. Her thoughts turned toward Nathan, her son, her only child. The name alone carried a complicated weight. Nathan lived downstate near Grand Rapids, married, busy, successful. The kind of life parents are supposed to celebrate. And she did. Or at least she tried. The distance between them hadn't appeared overnight. Years had built it. Small disappointments, missed conversations, things neither one knew how to say. After Richard became sick, Evelyn had thrown herself entirely into caregiving. Hospital visits, appointments, medications, insurance battles. Every hour belonged to someone who needed something. Nathan called less often. Then she called less often. Then months slipped by, not because they stopped loving each other, because life quietly moved them into different rooms. She remembered staring at her phone after the eviction notice arrived, his number already open, ready to dial. All she had to do was press one button. She never did. Maybe pride stopped her, maybe fear, maybe she simply couldn't bear hearing hesitation in her son's voice. So she loaded the truck herself and left. The cabin had not been part of a plan. It had been a memory, nothing more. A place she suddenly remembered existed when every other possibility disappeared. The last place left, her grandfather's cabin, Walter Harper. Even now, decades after his death, thinking about him felt different from thinking about anyone else. Walter had never spoken many words, but whenever he promised something, it stayed promised. When he built a chair, it lasted 50 years. When he fixed a roof, it stayed fixed. When he said he'd be somewhere, he showed up. Simple, reliable, Solid, the kind of man who became rarer with every passing year. Evelyn glanced toward the cabin again. 1,000 memories seemed to hang around it. Summer mornings on the dock, the smell of fresh-cut cedar, the sound of Walter's hammer ringing through the trees. Back then, she had never imagined the cabin becoming a refuge. It had simply been part of childhood, a place that always existed, like the lake, like the forest, like her grandfather himself. The sleet intensified. Tiny pellets clicked against the windshield. The daylight was fading. Shadows stretched between the pines. Ranger shifted beside her, not relaxing, waiting. His gaze remained fixed on the cabin, on whatever was inside. Evelyn followed his stare. The open door still hadn't moved. The smoke still rose from the chimney. And for the first time since arriving, she realized something else. No vehicle was visible, no tire tracks obvious from this distance, no sign explaining who belonged there, just the cabin, the smoke, the open door, and a stranger she had glimpsed only as a shadow. The truck suddenly felt very small, very temporary, as if everything that existed before this moment belonged to another life. Evelyn drew a slow breath, then another. Finally, she reached for the door handle. The cold metal felt real beneath her fingers. Outside, the storm continued building. Inside the cabin, someone was waiting. And whatever happened next would begin the moment she stepped out of the truck. Evelyn opened the door. A blast of cold air rushed inside. Immediately, Ranger jumped down from the passenger seat. His paws landed softly in the slush. The German Shepherd stood beside her truck door, shoulders rigid, eyes fixed on the cabin. He wasn't barking. That worried her more. Ranger had always barked when something startled him. A delivery driver, a deer too close to camp, a stranger approaching after dark. Barking was simple, predictable. This wasn't. This was calculation. The sleet stung Evelyn's cheeks as she pulled her coat tighter and started toward the cabin. The old gravel path was barely visible beneath the thin layer of snow. Each step felt strangely familiar, as if her feet remembered the route long before her mind did. The porch appeared exactly as she remembered. The same broad wooden planks, the same hand-carved railing, the same iron bell Walter had mounted beside the door. Sometime in the 1960s, the bell was still there, green with age. Silent, Ranger moved ahead of her, not rushing, not pulling, watching. The open door creaked slightly in the wind. The smell reached her before the warmth did. Wood smoke, fresh coffee, pine resin. For one dizzying second, she was 10 years old again, standing beside her grandfather's workbench while he sharpened chisels by lantern light. The memory vanished as quickly as it arrived. A floorboard creaked inside. Someone moved. Evelyn stopped just outside the doorway. Her pulse quickened. Then a calm voice drifted out from the cabin. "Well," a pause. "I was beginning to think you'd sit in that truck all night." The voice belonged to an older man, not threatening, not surprised, as though he had expected her. That realization unsettled her even more. Ranger's growl returned, low, steady. The sound seemed to vibrate through the porch floor. Evelyn stepped inside. Warmth immediately wrapped around her. The sudden change made her eyes water. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Shadows danced across familiar walls. For a moment she simply stood there, taking everything in. The cabin looked lived in, not abandoned, not forgotten. A kettle sat on the stove. A pair of reading glasses rested beside an open newspaper. Fresh split wood was stacked neatly near the fireplace. The room smelled clean, maintained, cared for. A man sat in a wooden chair near the fire. He looked to be in his early 70s, tall, broad-shouldered despite his age. Gray hair cropped short beneath a faded wool cap, weathered skin, sharp blue eyes, the kind of face shaped by decades outdoors. Not handsome, not intimidating, simply durable. The man slowly stood. His movements were careful but strong, like someone who still trusted his body. "You're Evelyn Harper." It wasn't a question. Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. "How do you know who I am?" The man nodded toward a framed photograph hanging near the fireplace. She turned. The picture showed a teenage girl standing beside Walter Harper on the cabin dock, fishing rods in hand, both smiling. The girl was her. The man smiled faintly. I've been looking at that photograph for years. Ranger moved between them. The German shepherd positioned himself slightly in front of Evelyn, protective, alert. The stranger noticed. So that's Ranger, again. Not a question. Evelyn frowned. How do you know my dog's name? The man sighed softly. Not annoyed, not nervous, just patient. My name is Caleb Mercer. He extended a hand. Evelyn didn't take it. After a second, Caleb lowered it. Fair enough, he said. You've had a long day, Ranger continued staring. His eyes never left Caleb, not once. The silence stretched. Finally, Evelyn spoke. Start explaining. Caleb glanced toward the fireplace, then toward the storm outside. Snow was falling harder now. The windows rattled faintly beneath a gust of wind. You should sit down first. I'll stand. Caleb accepted that. Your grandfather, Walter, and I knew each other. Evelyn said nothing. Met him back in 1981. I was a conservation officer, fresh out of training. Thought I knew everything. A faint smile crossed his face. Walter spent about 10 minutes proving otherwise. The smile disappeared. He saved my life once. That got her attention. Caleb walked slowly toward the fireplace. The flames reflected in his eyes. There was a winter search operation. Ice gave way beneath me. I ended up in water that should have killed me. He poked the fire once with a steel tool. Your grandfather pulled me out. The cabin fell quiet except for the crackle of burning logs. Evelyn studied him. The story felt real. Not rehearsed, not exaggerated. Real, still. Something didn't fit. If you knew my grandfather, why are you living in his cabin? I'm not living here. You've got coffee brewing and a fire going. Caleb nodded. Because I come here. Why? The older man looked around the room. His gaze lingered briefly on the walls, the furniture, the photographs, the ceiling beams, things he clearly knew well, because somebody needed to. Evelyn felt frustration rising. That doesn't answer the question. No, he met her eyes. It doesn't. Ranger suddenly moved closer. The dog's nose twitched. He circled once around Caleb's chair, then stopped, watching, evaluating. Caleb noticed. Again, no fear, no irritation. Just observation. He doesn't trust me. No, he shouldn't. That answer surprised Evelyn. Caleb walked toward the stove and poured coffee into 2 mugs. Steam curled upward. The rich smell filled the room. He set one mug on the table, not pushing it toward her, simply leaving it there, giving her the choice. The gesture reminded her unexpectedly of Walter. Her grandfather had always done that. Never pressured, never insisted, just offered. The similarity unsettled her. Evelyn finally removed her gloves. Her fingers were stiff from the cold. She wrapped both hands around the warm mug. The heat felt wonderful. Ranger remained standing, still watching. The storm intensified outside. Snow struck the windows harder now. The cabin creaked softly beneath the wind. For a while neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was cautious, like 2 people trying to decide whether honesty would be safe. Eventually, Caleb broke it. 3 days ago, you were evicted. Evelyn's head snapped up. How do you know that? I didn't know the exact day. His expression remained calm. But I knew it'd happen eventually. The words landed heavily. What does that mean? Caleb stared into the fire. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on his face. Not fear, not guilt. Something else. As though he were carefully choosing which truths belonged where. I mean, your grandfather worried about you. The room suddenly felt smaller. Evelyn laughed once. A short, bitter sound. My grandfather's been dead for 20 years. 17. She blinked. Caleb corrected her automatically, without thinking. The way someone does when they remember. Not when they guess. 17 years, he repeated quietly. Ranger's growl returned, soft, barely audible. But there, the dog was staring at Caleb with unwavering intensity. Evelyn followed his gaze. Something was bothering Ranger, something specific. The dog wasn't reacting to the cabin, or the storm, or the unfamiliar surroundings. He was reacting to the man, not aggressively, not violently, just persistently. Like he sensed something hidden beneath the surface, something not being said. Caleb looked back at Evelyn. His expression remained steady, reasonable, trustworthy, even. And yet the uneasy feeling that had begun in the truck refused to disappear. If anything, it had grown stronger. The fire crackled, snow swirled beyond the windows. The old cabin groaned softly beneath another gust of wind. And as darkness settled over the lake outside, Evelyn Harper realized she had accepted only one thing for certain. Caleb Mercer was not a squatter. He was not a stranger who had wandered into an empty cabin. He belonged here somehow. The problem was that she still had no idea why, and neither, apparently, did Ranger. The storm lasted through most of the night. Wind pushed against the cabin walls in long, mournful gusts. Snow piled against the porch steps. Branches scraped softly across the roof. Evelyn slept very little, not because she felt unsafe, because every time she closed her eyes, she found herself listening for footsteps, listening for doors opening, listening for clues that might explain why Caleb Mercer seemed so familiar with a cabin that technically belonged to her family. Just before dawn, she finally drifted into a shallow sleep in the small upstairs bedroom where she had slept as a girl. When she woke, pale winter sunlight was filtering through the curtains. For a few seconds, she forgot where she was. Then she smelled wood smoke and remembered everything: the cabin, the stranger, the growling dog, the life she had left behind. Ranger was already awake. He sat beside the window watching the woods, silent, alert as always. When Evelyn came downstairs, Caleb was standing at the kitchen counter making breakfast. Bacon crackled in a cast-iron skillet. Coffee brewed nearby. The smell filled the cabin. For a moment the scene looked so normal it almost felt absurd. A stranger cooking breakfast in her grandfather's cabin. "Morning," Caleb said. "Morning." Neither mentioned the tension from the night before. Neither seemed eager to. They ate quietly. Outside, the storm had left nearly 8 inches of fresh snow. The lake beyond the trees shimmered beneath weak winter sunlight. The world looked untouched, clean, still. After breakfast, Caleb spent several hours splitting firewood beside the shed. Evelyn watched from the porch. His movements were practiced, efficient, not the actions of a man pretending to know the property, the actions of someone who had worked here for years. That realization should have reassured her. Instead, it raised new questions. By afternoon, she decided she needed something to do besides think. The cabin had accumulated years of dust and small repairs, loose hinges, warped shelves, a cracked drawer in one of the bedrooms. The work felt comforting, familiar. She spent hours cleaning, sweeping corners, folding old blankets, sorting forgotten kitchen supplies. As she worked, memories surfaced. Walter teaching her how to hammer nails straight. Walter showing her how to sharpen a pocket knife. Walter insisting every tool had a place, and every place had a purpose. The cabin seemed full of him. His fingerprints were everywhere. Not literally, but in the details, the craftsmanship, the order, the care. Late that afternoon, she carried a box of cleaning supplies toward a storage room near the back of the cabin. The room hadn't changed much. Old shelves lined the walls. Fishing gear, lanterns, paint cans, tools. Then something caught her attention. A set of muddy boot prints. Fresh. Evelyn stopped. The tracks crossed the dusty floor toward a cabinet in the corner. The dust everywhere else looked undisturbed. These prints did not. She crouched lower, studying them. Not old. Recent. Very recent. Someone had been here. She followed the tracks to the cabinet. The doors stood slightly open. Inside, several boxes had clearly been moved. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for someone searching for something. Or checking on something. A chill moved through her. When Caleb returned from outside, she asked about it. He looked at the cabinet, then at the footprints. "I noticed those last month." "You did?" He nodded. I assumed they were mine. You assumed? Maybe. His answer felt strangely incomplete. Evelyn waited for more. None came. That evening, Ranger became restless. Not aggressive, restless. The difference mattered. The dog paced near the windows, checked the front door, returned to the fireplace, then repeated the process several times. At one point, he stood near the hallway leading toward the storage rooms, his ears lifted, his head tilted slightly, listening. Then he walked away. Evelyn noticed. So did Caleb. Neither commented. The next morning brought another surprise. Fresh tire tracks. Evelyn discovered them while carrying firewood. They cut through the snow near the edge of the property. Deep tracks, truck tires, recent. The snowfall from the previous day should have erased older marks. These had appeared overnight. She stared at them. The tracks led into the woods, then disappeared. No vehicle remained, no explanation, just evidence. When Caleb came over, she pointed. Have you had visitors? No. You sure? Positive. The answer came too quickly, not defensive, just firm. Again, that uneasy feeling returned. By the third day, Evelyn began noticing other things, small things, the kind that seem meaningless by themselves. A drawer left slightly open. A stack of old magazines shifted from where she'd placed them. A lantern hanging on a different hook. Nothing dramatic, nothing she could prove. Yet the cabin felt less abandoned than it should, less forgotten. Almost as though invisible routines had continued here long after Walter's death. Then came the photographs. The discovery happened accidentally. Evelyn was dusting the living room wall where family pictures hung in simple wooden frames. Many were exactly as she remembered. Walter standing beside a fishing boat, her grandmother on the dock. Family reunions from decades ago. Then she noticed gaps, empty spaces, small rectangular outlines where photographs had once hung. She counted 4 missing frames. Maybe 5. The wall had been rearranged, carefully, deliberately. Someone had removed photographs, not stolen valuables, not artwork, family photographs. Why? The question stayed with her all day. That evening, shortly before sunset, Ranger finally did something he had not done since arriving. He took charge. The German Shepherd appeared at her side while she was reading in the living room. Without warning, he nudged her hand, then walked toward the door. When she didn't move, he returned, nudged her again, more insistently. Eager for a walk, Ranger turned and headed outside. Evelyn followed. The dog moved across the snowy yard with unusual purpose, past the woodpile, past the well, toward an old shed sitting near the tree line. She remembered the building vaguely. Walter used it for tools and seasonal storage. The roof sagged slightly now. Snow covered half the structure. Ranger reached the shed and stopped, completely stopped. He stared at it, not the door, not the roof, the entire building. His body became rigid, the same posture she'd seen when they first arrived, the same intense focus. Evelyn? Caleb's voice drifted from behind. He had stepped onto the porch. She pointed toward Ranger. He's been doing this all week. Caleb studied the dog. Neither spoke for several seconds. Ranger never moved. The evening light faded across the snow. Long shadows stretched between the pines. The lake reflected a pale silver sky. Finally, Evelyn took a few steps toward the shed. Ranger immediately followed. Close, protective. The door creaked when she opened it. Inside, she found old tools, garden equipment, fishing nets, nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Yet Ranger refused to leave. He remained near the doorway, watching, waiting, as if expecting something, or remembering something. Evelyn looked back toward the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney. The windows glowed warmly against the coming darkness. From a distance, it looked peaceful, safe, simple. But standing beside that forgotten shed with Ranger staring into the shadows, she found herself wondering something she had not considered before. Maybe Caleb Mercer wasn't the only person connected to this place. Maybe someone else had been coming here. Someone neither of them was talking about. And for the first time since arriving, Evelyn began to suspect the cabin was holding on to more secrets than either of them had admitted. That thought stayed with her for days. It followed her through breakfast, through long walks with Ranger along the frozen shoreline, through quiet evenings spent watching firelight move across the walls. The cabin no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied, not by people, by unfinished things, questions, memories, pieces of a story that had been left scattered across decades. The first week of December arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. The storms finally eased. Sunlight reflected off the snow so brightly it hurt Evelyn's eyes when she stepped outside. She welcomed the work. Physical work made it easier not to think. Each morning she found another project. Repair a loose cabinet, replace a broken latch, organize storage shelves. The cabin seemed grateful for attention, as if it had been waiting a very long time for someone to notice the small things. One afternoon, she carried a toolbox upstairs to the back bedroom. The room had once belonged to her, or at least it had during those summers long ago. The narrow iron bed still stood against the wall. A faded patchwork quilt rested neatly folded at its foot. The curtains had yellowed with age. Dust gathered in the corners, but the room remained recognizable. She could still picture herself at 14, sitting beside the window reading library books while Walter worked outside. The memory felt strangely close, as if 40 years had somehow collapsed into a single afternoon. Ranger followed her upstairs. He always did. The dog settled near the doorway while she examined the room. One section of paneling beside the closet had begun pulling away from the wall. Nothing serious. Just old wood shrinking and expanding through decades of Michigan winters. Evelyn knelt beside it with a screwdriver. The panel shifted more than she expected. She frowned. The movement didn't feel right. She removed another screw, then another. The panel loosened further. Behind it appeared a narrow gap. At first she assumed it was simply empty wall space. Then she noticed something. Paper. A corner of yellowed paper tucked behind the boards. Her heartbeat quickened. Slowly, she widened the opening. Dust drifted into the sunlight. A hidden cavity emerged between the wall studs. Inside sat several envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. Nothing else, just letters. Ranger immediately stood. The German shepherd approached quietly and watched her. His ears lifted, interested, curious, almost as if he understood this mattered. Evelyn carefully pulled the bundle free. The envelopes were old, very old. The paper felt fragile beneath her fingers. Each carried the same familiar handwriting. Walter Harper. For a moment she simply stared. She had not seen his handwriting in years. The sight alone tightened her throat. She sat on the edge of the bed, untied the ribbon, opened the first envelope. The letter began simply, "If you're reading this, then you finally came home." Evelyn stopped breathing for a second. The room seemed to fall silent. Even the wind outside disappeared. She read the line again, then again. The words felt impossible, not because they were dramatic, because they sounded exactly like Walter, direct, practical, certain. No wasted language, no unnecessary sentiment. She continued reading. The letter had been written during the final months of his life. Walter described repairs he hoped would still be holding. The condition of the roof, the condition of the dock, the condition of the workshop. Then came a sentence that made Evelyn sit straighter. "I've always believed you'd return one day. Not because life would be easy, because it wouldn't. The cabin was never meant to be abandoned. It was meant to wait." Evelyn lowered the paper. A strange feeling moved through her. Not sadness, not happiness. Something harder to name. The feeling of being expected, of being remembered. She opened another letter, then another. Hours slipped by. The winter sunlight gradually faded. Walter's words filled the room. Some letters described the property. Others described family events, memories, observations, thoughts he apparently never intended anyone else to read. Again and again, one theme appeared. Walter believed Evelyn would eventually come back. Not maybe, not possibly, certainly, as if he had planned for it, as if he had been preparing for it. The realization unsettled her. How could anyone predict something like that? Downstairs, the cabin settled with a soft creak. Ranger remained beside her, watching, waiting. Late in the afternoon, she reached the final envelope. Unlike the others, it had never been sealed. The paper inside appeared unfinished. Several paragraphs ended abruptly. As though Walter had been interrupted while writing, she began reading. The letter discussed family matters, property records, old documents, things she didn't fully understand. Then she reached a single sentence written near the bottom of the page. The handwriting immediately caught her attention. The words appeared darker, pressed harder into the paper, as though Walter had wanted to make absolutely certain they were seen. If the truth ever disappears, follow the records beneath the workshop. Evelyn stared. The sentence seemed strangely out of place. Truth? What truth? What records? Beneath the workshop. She read the line sought several more times. Nothing around it explained the meaning. The letter simply ended. No conclusion, no signature, no clarification. Only that sentence. A shiver ran through her, not from the cold, from the feeling that she had just stepped onto the first stone of a path she couldn't yet see. By the time she came downstairs, darkness had fallen. The cabin glowed warmly against the winter night. Caleb sat near the fireplace reading. He looked up as she entered. Immediately, he noticed the letters in her hands. Something changed in his expression. Not surprise, recognition. You found them. It wasn't a question. Evelyn stopped. You knew they were there? Caleb closed his book slowly. I knew Walter hid something in the cabin. You never mentioned it. No. The answer came calmly. Too calmly. The familiar unease returned. Evelyn studied him across the room. Why not? Caleb looked toward the fire. For a moment he seemed older than before, more tired. I figured if he wanted you to find them, he'd show you where. He? Your grandfather. The answer only deepened the mystery. Evelyn sat in silence. The letters rested in her lap. Ranger settled beside her chair. The dog's head lay across his paws, but his eyes remained open, watching, always watching. Outside, snow began falling again. Small flakes drifted past the windows. Inside, Walter's words echoed through her thoughts. The cabin was meant to wait. I've always believed you'd return. If the truth ever disappears, follow the records beneath the workshop. For the first time since arriving, Evelyn realized her grandfather had left behind more than a home. He had left instructions. And somewhere beneath the surface of this quiet property, a deeper story was waiting to be uncovered. For the next several days, Evelyn found herself thinking about little else. The unfinished letter remained folded inside her sweater pocket. She carried it everywhere. Sometimes she would take it out and read the final sentence again. If the truth ever disappears, follow the records beneath the workshop. The words seemed simple, yet they pulled at her constantly, like a loose thread. The more she ignored it, the harder it tugged. Outside, winter settled fully over the Upper Peninsula. Snow covered the shoreline. Ice spread farther across the lake each morning. The forest became quieter. Even the birds seemed fewer. Most afternoons, Evelyn walked to the workshop. The building sat 30 yards behind the cabin. Walter had spent thousands of hours there. She could still smell him when she opened the door. Sawdust, machine oil, pine, the scent of projects in progress, the scent of things being built. Inside, sunlight filtered through old windows and illuminated workbenches worn smooth by decades of use. Hand tools hung neatly on pegboards, planes, chisels, squares, clamps, everything arranged exactly as Walter would have left it, or so it appeared. Evelyn searched carefully. She checked beneath benches, inside cabinets, behind shelving. Nothing. No hidden compartment, no records, no obvious clues, just a workshop. After 3 days, she began wondering if she was misinterpreting the letter entirely. Maybe Walter had meant something symbolic. Maybe the records were gone. Maybe the truth had disappeared long ago. Then the storm arrived. It rolled across Lake Superior overnight. The weather forecast warned of heavy snowfall and dangerous winds. By dawn, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Snow swirled around the cabin in white waves. The trees bent beneath powerful gusts. Around noon, the power failed. The lights flickered once, twice, then vanished. The cabin fell silent. Only the wind remained. Caleb glanced toward the dark ceiling fixture. "Well," he said quietly, "there it goes." Neither seemed particularly concerned. The cabin had survived decades before electricity. It could survive another day without it. They lit lanterns, added more wood to the fire, waited out the storm. By late afternoon, the weather had become almost violent. The wind shook the windows. Snow hammered against the glass. The lake beyond the trees had disappeared completely. Everything outside looked white and moving. Ranger spent most of the day pacing, not anxiously, purposefully, back and forth, from the fireplace to the hallway, from the hallway to the kitchen, then back again. Evelyn noticed. So did Caleb. "He's been restless all day," she said. Caleb nodded. "Something's got his attention." The German shepherd stopped suddenly. His ears rose, his head turned toward the workshop. Even through the storm, even through the walls, he seemed focused on something beyond the cabin. A few minutes later, he moved to the door, sat, waited. When nobody reacted, he stood again, paced, returned to the door. "Evelyn," she looked up. Caleb was watching Ranger now. "That's not normal, is it?" "No." The dog let out a low whine, then scratched once at the floor beside the door. Not demanding, not impatient, intentional. Evelyn stood. "So what are you trying to tell us?" Immediately, Ranger became alert. His tail lifted. He moved toward the door again. The reaction was so immediate that both adults noticed. Caleb grabbed a lantern. "Let's take a look." Opening the door felt like stepping into another world. Wind slammed against them. Snow whipped through the darkness. Ranger pushed ahead, determined. The beam from Caleb's lantern bounced across the white landscape. The workshop barely appeared through the storm, a dark shape beneath moving snow. By the time they reached it, Evelyn's cheeks burned from the cold. Inside, the workshop felt strangely calm. The wind became muffled. The lantern light cast long shadows across the room. Ranger immediately began moving, not randomly, directly. He crossed the workshop floor and stopped near the far wall, a section beneath an old workbench. The dog lowered his nose, sniffed, then scratched. Once, twice, 3 times. Wood splintered beneath his claws. Evelyn and Caleb exchanged a look. Neither spoke. Ranger scratched again, harder this time. The sound echoed through the room. Caleb slowly knelt beside him. "What have you got there, boy?" The floor appeared ordinary. Old wooden planks, dust, nothing unusual, yet Ranger refused to move. He scratched again, then stepped back, watching them expectantly. Evelyn crouched beside the spot. Her fingers traced along the floorboards. At first she found nothing. Then, a seam, tiny, almost invisible. She froze. "Caleb," he moved closer. "What is it?" She ran her fingers along the edge again. There, definitely there. A narrow line between boards that didn't match the rest of the floor. Caleb set the lantern down. Together they cleared away dust and debris. The seam became more obvious. Not a crack, a boundary. Something separate from the surrounding floor. Their pulse seemed to synchronize. Neither wanted to say it aloud. Not yet. Caleb retrieved a pry bar from the wall. The metal slipped beneath the edge. He applied pressure. For a moment, nothing happened. Then wood shifted. A dull thump echoed beneath the floor. Evelyn's breath caught. The section lifted. Not much, just enough. Enough to reveal darkness underneath. Ranger immediately stood, ears forward, eyes fixed. The hatch opened slowly, hidden beneath decades of dust, beneath years of silence, beneath Walter's workshop. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Neither spoke. The storm howled outside. The lantern flame flickered. The opening seemed impossibly out of place, as though part of another story entirely. Caleb looked at Evelyn. "You okay?" She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. Together they descended. The staircase led only a few feet below ground level. At the bottom sat a small storage room, not large, perhaps 10 feet by 12, dry, carefully constructed, protected. As the lantern light spread through the space, shapes emerged from the darkness. Shelves, boxes, cabinets, files, dozens of them. Evelyn stared. There were journals, leather-bound and neatly labeled, photographs organized into archival containers, maps rolled inside tubes, cassette tapes stacked in rows, folders filled with documents, records stretching back decades, not hidden treasure, not money, something far more personal, something preserved, protected, remembered. Walter had built an entire archive beneath his workshop, a history buried beneath the cabin. Evelyn slowly approached the nearest shelf. Her hand trembled as she touched one of the journals. The date written across the cover stopped her cold. She looked at the next, then another, year after year, decade after decade, a record of something. But what? Caleb stood silently nearby. Even he seemed overwhelmed. Ranger descended the final step and sat beside Evelyn, calm now, focused, as though his task had finally been completed. Evelyn looked around the hidden room, at the photographs, the journals, the boxes of carefully preserved documents, and suddenly she understood something. The mystery had changed. The question was no longer who had been inside the cabin, or why Caleb had stayed, or why photographs were missing. The real question was now standing all around her. What truth had Walter Harper spent years protecting beneath this workshop, and why had he believed it might disappear? The storm continued through the night, but Evelyn barely noticed. Back in the cabin, lanterns glowed softly against the walls while snow swept past the windows in endless waves. The hidden room beneath the workshop had changed everything. Boxes now sat on the dining table. Journals, photographs, file folders, stacks of carefully labeled records. Ranger lay near the fireplace, finally relaxed. For the first time since arriving, the German shepherd seemed at peace, as though finding the hidden room had completed something he had sensed long before any of them understood it. Caleb sat quietly at one end of the table, reading glasses perched low on his nose, a journal open in front of him. Neither spoke much. The silence felt different now, not cautious, focused. Hours passed. Evelyn moved through the records slowly. There was too much to absorb all at once. Walter had documented nearly everything. Family visits, property maintenance, community events, letters, phone logs, photographs, notes, names. Tiny details most people would have forgotten. Walter had preserved them all. Near midnight, she opened a box labeled Family Correspondence. Inside sat dozens of envelopes. Most were addressed to her. Her stomach tightened. She picked one up. The postmark was from 2008, another from 2010, another from 2012. Some were unopened. Some had been returned. Others looked as though they had never reached a mailbox at all. She frowned. Caleb, he looked up. What is it? She held up an envelope. Why would Grandpa keep letters addressed to me? Caleb removed his glasses. His expression darkened slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. The same expression she had seen when finding the hidden letters upstairs. He knew something. Again, Evelyn felt frustration rising. What? Caleb looked away, toward the fire, toward the darkness beyond the windows. Finally, he sighed. Keep reading. That answer irritated her, but she did. The first letter inside had been written by Walter 12 years earlier. Simple updates. News about the cabin. News about local friends. The tone was warm, personal, familiar. Exactly the kind of letter she would have loved receiving. The second letter was similar. Then a third, and a fourth. Evelyn's hands began trembling. She had never seen any of them. Not one, not a single letter. She opened another envelope. Inside, she found a photocopy. Attached was a handwritten note from Walter. Mail returned again. Address supposedly invalid. But she knew the address. She had lived there for years. The address wasn't invalid. The realization settled heavily in her chest. Something wasn't right. The next discovery came an hour later. A notebook, small, black, plain. Walter's handwriting filled every page, phone records. At first, the entries seemed mundane. Dates, times, brief notes. Then one entry stopped her cold, called Evelyn. Message relayed through Diane. Evelyn unavailable. Another. Left message with Diane. She said Evelyn wasn't interested in discussing family matters. Then another. Diane claims Evelyn requested no further contact. Evelyn stared at the page. Her heartbeat quickened. No, that wasn't possible. She had never said that. Never. The room suddenly felt warmer, smaller. She turned pages rapidly. More entries appeared, year after year. The same name. Diane Holloway, her younger cousin. The cousin who lived closest to Walter during his later years. The cousin everyone trusted. The cousin who always volunteered to help. The cousin who had managed family communication after several relatives became elderly. A memory surfaced. A family gathering 15 years ago. Diane casually mentioning that Walter seemed tired, that he wasn't writing much anymore, that he preferred privacy. At the time, Evelyn had accepted it. Why wouldn't she? Now she wasn't so sure. She kept reading. Each new entry deepened the wound. Walter had written repeatedly. He had called repeatedly. He had asked about her, asked for her, tried reaching her, and somehow the messages never arrived. Across the table, Caleb slowly closed his journal. He could see the change happening, the pieces coming together. Evelyn. She didn't answer. Her eyes remained locked on the pages. The evidence was overwhelming. Letters, phone records, notes, documentation spanning years. Not one misunderstanding, not one mistake. A pattern, a deliberate pattern. The realization hit her with almost physical force. For decades, she had believed distance simply happened. Life got busy. People drifted apart. Relationships faded. That was the story, she told herself. It was easier that way, easier than wondering why nobody called, why nobody wrote, why invitations stopped arriving, why family news seemed to reach her years late. Now the records told a different story, a much darker one. The distance hadn't happened naturally. Someone had helped create it. She pushed back from the table. The chair scraped sharply against the floor. Ranger immediately lifted his head, alert, concerned. Evelyn walked to the window. Snow drifted through darkness outside. The cabin reflected faintly in the glass. An old woman staring at a truth she never expected to find. She remembered her mother's funeral. Diane handling most of the arrangements. Diane assuring everyone she'd informed Evelyn about schedule changes. Had she, or hadn't she? She remembered missing a family reunion years later. The invitation supposedly mailed, except it never arrived. She remembered hearing about Walter's worsening health long after others already knew. At the time it seemed unfortunate. Now it seemed suspicious. One memory after another resurfaced, small things, forgettable things, until they weren't, until they formed a pattern. The pain wasn't financial. That became clear almost immediately. No money had been stolen, no inheritance hidden, no property taken. The loss was harder to measure. Years, conversations, relationships. Time she could never recover. Time Walter could never recover. Tears filled her eyes, not dramatic tears, not sudden, the slow kind, the kind that arrive when grief finally finds its true address. "I thought," she whispered, her voice cracked. "I thought they stopped caring." The words hung in the room. Caleb looked down, giving her privacy even while remaining present. Evelyn wiped her eyes, then failed to stop the next tears. And the ones after that. She thought about birthdays, Christmases, family gatherings, news she never received, calls that never came. Walter waiting for responses that never arrived. Walter believing she was choosing silence. Her believing he was choosing silence. Both wrong, both manipulated. The heartbreak was almost unbearable, because there had been no dramatic betrayal, no explosive argument, no final confrontation, just years, quietly stolen, by one person deciding she knew what was best. Hours later, Evelyn found the document that removed any remaining doubt, a letter. Not from Walter, from Diane, written to another relative. The contents weren't cruel, in some ways they were worse. Diane described Evelyn as distant, disinterested, too busy with her own life, probably unwilling to reconnect. The language sounded reasonable, concerned, protective, exactly the sort of thing people believe, especially when repeated often enough, especially when spoken by someone trusted. Evelyn lowered the page. The room blurred, not because she couldn't see, because she suddenly understood. Diane hadn't stolen money, she had stolen context. She had quietly rewritten relationships. Family members responded to the story they were given. And the story they were given wasn't true. The clock on the wall ticked softly. The fire settled lower. Ranger rose from his place near the hearth and crossed the room. Without hesitation, he rested his head against Evelyn's knee. She placed one hand on his neck. The familiar warmth grounded her. Outside, the storm finally began to weaken. The wind softened. Snow fell more gently. Inside the cabin, however, another storm had only just begun, because the truth hidden beneath Walter's workshop wasn't about property, or inheritance, or wealth. It was about something much harder to replace. A family she had spent years believing she had lost on her own, when in reality, much of it had been taken from her long before she ever knew it was disappearing. The days that followed felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, not yet, just quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives after a storm has knocked down a tree and left the forest wondering what changed. The snow stopped, the skies cleared, sunlight returned to the lake. Yet inside Evelyn, everything felt unsettled. She spent hours reading through Walter's journals. Some entries made her smile, others made her cry. Many left her staring into space for long stretches of time. Ranger rarely left her side. The German shepherd seemed to sense when she needed company. He would lie beside her chair while she read, walk beside her during long trips to the shoreline, wait outside the workshop when she needed time alone. Sometimes, his simple presence felt more comforting than words. One afternoon, Evelyn sat on the porch wrapped in a heavy blanket. The lake had frozen almost completely. The ice stretched across the water like pale glass. A cold wind moved through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. Caleb emerged from the woods carrying an armload of firewood. He stacked it beside the porch, then turned to leave. "Caleb." He stopped. For a moment neither spoke. Evelyn looked at him carefully, really looked at him. The weathered face, the tired eyes, the quiet patience. The man who had been here when she arrived. The man who had known far more than he admitted. The man Ranger had never quite trusted. "We need to talk." Caleb nodded once. "I figured we would." That evening they sat across from each other at the dining table. The fire burned low. A single lamp cast warm light across the room. Outside, darkness settled over the frozen lake. Ranger lay between them. His eyes moved back and forth as though following the conversation before it began. Evelyn placed one of Walter's journals on the table. "You knew." Caleb stared at the cover. "Some of it. How much?" A long silence followed. Finally, Caleb leaned back. Older suddenly, more tired, as though he had carried something heavy for a very long time. "More than I should have." The honesty surprised her. She had expected excuses, defensiveness, maybe even anger. Instead, she got honesty. "Then tell me." Caleb folded his hands. His gaze drifted toward the fire. The flames reflected softly in his eyes. "I met Walter in 1981. Evelyn nodded. She already knew that part. "He became one of my closest friends." Caleb paused. "Not because we were similar, because we weren't." A faint smile touched his face. "Walter was patient, I wasn't." The smile faded. "But there was one thing we shared." He looked toward the workshop window. "We both believed that truth matters." The room fell quiet. Caleb continued. "In 1994, Walter started noticing things." "What things?" "Missing letters." Evelyn's chest tightened. Conversations that didn't make sense. Stories that changed depending on who told them. Family members repeating things he'd never said. Ranger lifted his head slightly. The movement was small, but Evelyn noticed. The dog was listening. Caleb noticed too. He began keeping records. Evelyn glanced toward the journals. The hidden room, the files. Everything suddenly made more sense. He thought somebody was interfering? At first he hoped he was wrong. Caleb sighed. Then the evidence kept growing. The fire popped softly. Neither moved. Did he know it was Diane? Eventually. The answer came quietly, without anger, without judgment, just fact. Evelyn looked down. Part of her had still hoped there might be another explanation. A misunderstanding. A mistake. Something less painful. Caleb shook his head slightly. Walter spent years trying to understand why. Did he? Yes. The older man stared into the flames. He never believed Diane was trying to destroy anyone. Evelyn frowned. Then what was she doing? Caleb thought for a long moment, controlling the story. The words lingered, simple yet devastating. Some people want money, Caleb said. Some want attention. Some want power. His gaze met hers. And some want to decide who belongs where. The cabin settled softly around them. Wood creaked. The wind brushed the windows. Evelyn remembered countless family gatherings. Diane always in the center. Always organizing. Always explaining. Always managing information. At the time it had seemed helpful. Now it looked different. Very different. She swallowed. Why didn't Walter tell me? That question had haunted her for days. Caleb looked away, toward the old photographs, toward memories only he could see. When he spoke again, his voice was softer because he was afraid. The answer startled her. Walter wasn't afraid of much. No. Caleb nodded. He wasn't. A pause. But he was afraid of losing you twice. The words landed heavily. Evelyn said nothing, neither did Caleb. The silence stretched, then he continued. He worried that if he showed you everything too early, you'd leave. Leave? You'd be angry, hurt, overwhelmed. His eyes returned to hers. And he'd spent years watching people walk away when the truth arrived too fast. The room felt smaller, warmer, more intimate, as though Walter himself sat somewhere nearby listening. Evelyn looked down at the journal. The worn cover, the careful handwriting, the decades of records. He planned all this. Caleb smiled sadly. More than you know. The answer hung in the air. Then something clicked. A realization. One that had been waiting quietly in the background since the first day. Evelyn looked toward Ranger. The German shepherd remained stretched across the floor. Calm, watchful, present. Then she looked back at Caleb. The growling. Caleb nodded immediately. He knew exactly what she meant. The first night, yes. Why? The older man laughed softly. Not because the question was funny. Because he had apparently asked himself the same thing many times. Ranger opened one eye, watching them. Honestly? Please. Caleb leaned forward slightly. I think Ranger knew something was wrong. Evelyn frowned. You weren't dangerous. No. And he wasn't acting scared. No. The fire crackled softly. Caleb rubbed his chin, searching for the right words. Then he found them. He knew I wasn't telling the whole truth. The simplicity of the answer stunned her. Not danger, not threat, not aggression, just tension, secrets, hesitation, things left unsaid. Ranger had sensed it immediately, long before she did, long before any hidden room was discovered. The dog had recognized uncertainty. A conflict invisible to everyone else. Caleb looked toward Ranger. You remember that first night, don't you? The German shepherd thumped his tail once against the floor. The gesture made both of them smile. For the first time since arriving, Evelyn felt something inside her begin to settle. Not heal, not completely, but settle. The mystery that had started on the forest road finally had an answer. The smoke, the stranger, the growl, the shadow behind the window. All of it led here, not to danger, to truth. Truth waiting behind locked doors. Truth waiting beneath floorboards. Truth waiting inside journals. Truth waiting inside people. The fire burned lower. Outside, moonlight reflected across the frozen lake. Silver still, beautiful. Inside the cabin, Evelyn sat quietly and thought about Walter. about promises, about patience, about a man who had trusted time more than urgency, a man who had spent years preparing a path she was only now beginning to understand. And for the first time since stepping through the cabin door, she felt ready for what came next. Not the records, not Diane, not the past, Nathan, her son, the conversation she had avoided for years. The wound she could no longer blame on missing letters or stolen messages. That one belonged to both of them. And somewhere deep inside, she knew the moment was coming. Soon, very soon, the realization followed Evelyn everywhere. Through breakfast, through chores, through long walks along the frozen shoreline with Ranger. The cabin had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, like water reshaping stone. For weeks she had focused on Walter, on Diane, on the hidden records, on the family she had lost. Now there was nowhere left to hide from the one relationship that belonged entirely to her. Nathan, her son. The name alone carried a complicated mixture of love, regret, pride, and sadness, the kind of emotions that only exist between parents and children. She thought about him every day, had for years, even during the long stretches when neither called, even when silence became easier than conversation, especially then. One cold morning in late January, Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink watching snowdrift across the lake. The cabin was quiet. Caleb had gone into town for supplies. Ranger slept near the fireplace. The phone sat on the counter, a simple object, small, ordinary. Yet it felt heavier than anything she had lifted in months. She stared at it, then looked away, then looked back. Not today. That was what she told herself. Maybe tomorrow, but tomorrow arrived. Then another. Then another. The phone remained where it was, waiting. February came. The days grew slightly longer. Sunlight lingered a little later each evening. Tiny signs that winter would not last forever. One afternoon, Evelyn found herself sitting inside the workshop. Walter's journals spread across the workbench. She wasn't reading, just sitting, thinking. A particular journal lay open before her. An entry written only a few years before Walter's death. She had read it several times already. Yet something about it kept pulling her back. The entry wasn't about Diane, or family records, or property. It was about Nathan. Walter had met Nathan only a handful of times. Still, he had written, "The boy watches everything," just like Evelyn did. The danger isn't that he'll stop loving her. The danger is that one day he'll believe she stopped seeing him. Evelyn stared at the sentence, then read it again. The words struck harder each time, because they felt true, painfully true. She remembered missed birthdays, canceled visits, phone calls cut short because Richard needed something, holidays spent at hospitals, weekends consumed by caregiving, years where every ounce of energy had gone toward keeping someone else afloat. At the time it felt necessary. Of course it did. Richard was sick. Her responsibilities were real. But Nathan had been real too. And somewhere along the way, he had learned to stop expecting her. The thought hurt. Not because it was cruel, because it might be accurate. That evening she found herself sitting alone on the porch. The sky burned orange above the frozen lake. The air smelled clean and sharp. Ranger lay beside her feet. The dog lifted his head occasionally to watch distant deer moving between the trees. Otherwise, he remained still, content, present. A quality Evelyn envied. Eventually, Caleb joined her, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands. He offered one. She accepted. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt comfortable, earned. After several minutes, Caleb glanced toward her. "You've been carrying something around." Evelyn laughed softly. "That obvious?" "Only if somebody's paying attention." She looked out at the lake. The ice reflected the last light of day. Beautiful, cold, quiet. "I need to call my son." Caleb nodded, as though he'd been expecting that answer. "You should, I know." The admission came out barely above a whisper. "I just don't know what to say." Caleb considered that, then shrugged. Probably the truth. The simplicity of the answer irritated her slightly. which usually meant it was correct. 3 days later, she finally made the call. The moment arrived without warning. No dramatic decision, no speech, no perfect timing. She simply woke up knowing she couldn't avoid it anymore. The cabin felt unusually still that morning. Snow rested on the pines. The lake shone beneath pale winter sunlight. Ranger sat beside the front door, watching birds move through the trees. Evelyn carried the phone onto the porch, sat in Walter's old chair, and dialed. The ringing seemed impossibly loud. Once, twice, 3 times then. Hello, Nathan's voice, older than she remembered, familiar, and suddenly every prepared sentence vanished. For a moment she couldn't speak. Hello? More concerned this time, Nathan. Silence. Then another silence. Longer, different. Mom? The single word nearly broke her. She closed her eyes. It's me, I know. Another pause. The kind that carries years inside it. Are you okay? Of all the things he could have asked, that was the one that undid her. Not anger, not blame. Concern. She swallowed hard. I'm okay. The answer wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. Nathan exhaled slowly. I've been worried. Evelyn looked out across the frozen lake. Tears blurred the horizon. You had every right to be angry. I'm not angry. His answer came immediately, then softened. Not anymore. The conversation unfolded slowly, awkwardly, like two people crossing a frozen river and testing every step. Neither rushed, neither pretended. They simply told the truth. Nathan spoke first. About feeling forgotten. About years of watching emergencies consume every conversation, every visit, every holiday, every plan. Not because he doubted her love, because he stopped believing there was room for him inside it. Evelyn listened, really listened, without defending herself, without explaining, without trying to win. When it was her turn, she told him about Richard. The hospitals, the exhaustion, the fear, how easy it became to lose track of everything except survival, including herself, including him. Neither cried at first. Neither raised their voice. The honesty was too important for that. Eventually the tears came anyway. Quiet tears, human tears, the kind that appear when two people finally stop protecting themselves. At one point, neither spoke for almost a minute, just breathing, just remaining connected. The silence felt different now, not distance, presence. Nathan finally broke it. Mom, yeah? Where are you? She smiled through tears. Grandpa Walter's cabin, another pause. Then something surprising, a laugh, small, warm. I remember that place. You do? Bits of it. His voice softened. The workshop, the lake, that giant pine tree near the dock. Evelyn smiled. The memories had survived. Not all of them, but enough. I thought you'd forgotten. I never forgot. Neither mentioned how much those words mattered. They didn't need to. Near the end of the conversation, Nathan grew quiet again, as though working up courage. Then he asked, Can I come see you? Evelyn's breath caught. For a second, she was afraid to answer. Afraid the moment might disappear if she moved too quickly. Then she heard Walter's voice somewhere in memory. Steady, certain, showing up matters. Yes, her voice trembled. Please. Nathan laughed softly, relieved. I'll figure something out. After they hung up, Evelyn sat on the porch for a long time. The phone rested in her lap. The winter air felt different somehow, lighter. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Years don't heal in a single phone call. But something had changed. Something important. The door between them had opened. Weeks later, on a bright afternoon in early March, a dark SUV appeared at the end of the snowy road. Evelyn saw it through the front window. Her heart immediately began racing. Ranger stood, tail moving, not growling, not wary, simply curious. The vehicle approached slowly, crunching through snow, finally stopping beside the cabin. The driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out. Broad shoulders, dark coat, a little gray at his temples. Older, yet unmistakable, Nathan. For a moment neither moved. Mother and son separated by years, mistakes, misunderstandings, and silence, standing only yards apart. Then Nathan smiled, and Evelyn found herself walking toward him, before she even realized she'd started moving. The snow crunched beneath her boots. The distance between them wasn't far, 20 feet, maybe 30, yet it felt like crossing years. Nathan stepped away from the SUV. For a second, he looked exactly as she remembered him at 16. Then 25, then 30. The images seemed to overlap: child, young man, adult, her son. The person she had worried about every day, even when they barely spoke. Neither knew what to say first, so they did something better. They hugged. The embrace was awkward for half a second. Then neither let go. Evelyn felt tears immediately. Not dramatic tears, not painful ones, just relief, pure relief. Nathan held her tightly, the way people do when they're making sure someone is really there, when they need proof. Eventually they stepped apart, both laughing softly at their own emotions. Ranger approached next, tail wagging. The German shepherd circled Nathan once before accepting him fully. Nathan knelt immediately. "Hey, buddy." Ranger leaned into the attention, satisfied, approving. The sight made Evelyn smile. "Looks like I passed inspection." "You did." The rest of that afternoon passed naturally. No speeches, no dramatic conversations, just time together. Nathan carried groceries inside, asked questions about the cabin, listened to stories about Walter, walked through the workshop, examined old photographs. The missing years weren't erased, but they no longer stood between them quite the same way. That evening they sat beside the fireplace with Caleb. Coffee cups rested on the table. Snow glowed softly beyond the windows. Nathan listened carefully as Evelyn explained the hidden room beneath the workshop. The journals, the letters, the records, the discoveries. At one point he simply shook his head. "Grandpa Walter really thought of everything." Caleb laughed. "More than any of us realized." Nathan stayed 4 days, then 6, then 8. By the time he finally left, the cabin no longer felt isolated. The road between his life and Evelyn's life had been reopened. Not perfectly, not permanently. Relationships required maintenance. They both understood that now. But it existed again, and that mattered. Spring arrived slowly. The Upper Peninsula never rushed the seasons. The snow receded inch by inch. Ice broke apart along the lake. Water returned to the shoreline. Birdsong replaced winter silence. The first robin appeared near the workshop one bright April morning. Evelyn noticed it immediately. Walter always had. Now she did too. The cabin seemed to wake from a long sleep. Windows opened. Fresh air moved through the rooms. The scent of pine and thawing earth drifted inside. Ranger spent entire afternoons stretched across the porch. Content. Watching the world return. Nathan visited again in May. This time he didn't come alone. His wife, Melissa, stepped out of the SUV first. Warm smile, kind eyes. The sort of person who immediately made a place feel more welcoming. Then a small figure climbed out of the back seat. A little girl with dark hair and bright curiosity. Evelyn's granddaughter, Sophie, 6 years old. The moment she spotted the lake, she gasped. "Grandma, is that yours?" Evelyn laughed. "No, sweetheart." Sophie looked confused. "It looks like yours." The answer delighted everyone. Within an hour, Sophie had claimed the porch swing, named 3 squirrels, and asked approximately 200 questions. The cabin had not heard that much laughter in years, maybe decades. It suited the place. Throughout the summer, visits became regular. Not obligations, not scheduled duties. Visits because people wanted to be there. Barbecues near the lake, fishing trips, long evenings on the porch, stories, conversations, memories, new ones forming beside old ones. Meanwhile, Evelyn found herself returning often to Walter's workshop. Not because she needed answers anymore, because she wanted purpose. The hidden room beneath the floor contained more than family records. It contained local history, photographs of logging camps, maps, letters, stories from generations of families who had helped build the region, too valuable to remain hidden forever. One afternoon, she met with representatives from the County Historical Society. Over several months, The collection was carefully organized and preserved. Every photograph scanned, every journal cataloged, every recording protected. Walter's archive would survive, not hidden underground, not forgotten, remembered. The workshop changed too. Evelyn restored it gradually. Cleaned tools, repaired windows, rebuilt shelves. The old building filled with life once again. Soon local school groups began visiting. Children learned basic woodworking. They listened to stories about the region. They learned how people once built cabins without modern equipment, how communities preserved history, how objects carried memories. The sound of young voices inside Walter's workshop felt exactly right, as though the building had finally found its next purpose. One evening in late August, after a long day with visitors, Evelyn sat on the porch beside Ranger. The lake shimmered gold beneath the setting sun. A warm breeze moved through the pines. Sophie's laughter echoed from the yard. The little girl ran across the grass chasing fireflies. Nathan watched nearby. Melissa sat on the dock. Caleb was helping repair a loose fence post. The scene looked ordinary, which made it extraordinary. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. Ranger rested beside her feet. Older now, gray around the muzzle, content. She reached down and scratched his ears. Good boy. His tail thumped once against the porch. The same tail that had gone rigid on the day they arrived. The same dog who had growled at a stranger in the cabin. The same dog who had led them to the workshop, the hidden room, the truth. Across the yard, Sophie stopped suddenly. She pointed toward the cabin. Grandma, what is it? The little girl smiled. The door's open. Evelyn turned. The front door stood wide open behind them. Warm light spilled onto the porch. For a moment, she simply looked at it. Months earlier, that same sight had filled her with uncertainty, fear, questions. Now it meant something entirely different. Family coming and going, children running in and out, friends stopping by. Life, welcome, home. The evening light softened. The lake reflected the colors of sunset. And Evelyn found herself thinking about everything that had happened since that snowy day when she first drove up the old road. The eviction, the loneliness, the mystery, the records, the heartbreak, the phone call, the reunion. None of it had unfolded the way she imagined. Perhaps that was the point. The deepest losses in life are not always houses, savings accounts, or possessions. Sometimes they are years spent believing you were forgotten. Years spent carrying stories about yourself that were never true. The truth cannot return lost time. It cannot rewrite the past, but it can change what comes next. Walter had understood that. Maybe Caleb did too. Maybe Ranger had sensed it before any of them. A door does not always lead backward. Sometimes it opens toward the people who have been waiting for you all along. Evelyn looked at her family, then at the open cabin door, then at the lake beyond the trees. Peace settled over her quietly, like evening light, like a welcome home she hadn't expected to find. And this time, when she looked at the open door, she didn't wonder who was inside. She already knew. And this time, when she looked at the open door, she didn't wonder who was inside. She already knew. Sophie ran through it carrying a jar full of fireflies. Nathan followed behind her, laughing, and Melissa called out for them to leave at least a few of the fireflies outside. The sound drifted across the yard and settled into the evening air like it had always belonged there. Ranger lifted his head from the porch boards, watched them for a moment, then rested his chin back on his paws. Evelyn looked down at him and smiled. The funny thing was, the dog had never found a treasure. He hadn't uncovered money.
He hadn't tried up the villain. All he had done was refuse to ignore something that felt wrong. A road at the stranger, a stubborn focus on an own worship floor, a refusal to let the story stay buried. And because of that, an old woman learned that the loneliest year of her life had not happened for the reasons she believed. For months, she had thought she become to the cabin because she had nowhere else left to go. now she understood something different. The cabin hadn't given her a future, it had given her the truth, and the truth led her back to the people she thought were gone. The lake turned gone beneath the sun. Behind her, the door remained open, not because someone forgot to close it, because nobody needed to. Tell me, have you ever discovered that the story you were telling yourself about someone you loved wasn't the whole story after all?